my estimation, I call him the historian, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima. Again, we welcome you. We have been trying to make a rather monumental decision, and that is whether we should go upstairs. We have ample room upstairs, but you appear to be so comfortable, those of you who are seated, and we don't want to get you too far away from the kitchen, nor do we want to get you too far away from the books. So, however, I think we'd be a bit more comfortable. People are still standing, and
the new book which the Journal of African Civilizations has just released, African Presence in Early Europe, is the second in a trilogy, a three-part series of works: African Presence in Early Asia, which appeared in the spring of this year; African Presence in Early Europe, which has just appeared; and African Presence in Early America, which will appear hopefully in the fall of 1986. I say hopefully because under the enormous strain of my many duties, it has been very difficult to write the sequel. It's all in my head, it's finished. I have not put down a word of it. It's been many years since the publication of They Came Before Columbus. I completed that in 1976. It's now nearly 10 years, and those 10 years have seen the development of a school. This is the most important development, the development of a school of revisionist historians. That is why I attempted to found the Journal of African Civilizations, because my great concern was to make sure that the vast amount of knowledge that lies hidden in millions of books, not millions, thousands of books across the world would not be lost. This book is the work of many scholars. I edit it, I coordinate the research, I draw upon many sources, but it represents the work of a whole school. It is beginning to affect the teaching of anthropology and the teaching of African history, because students in many parts of the world will no longer accept this sterile focus and concentration on the primitive. This is something I feel that more than anything else has been achieved by the Journal of African Civilizations, which I edit, and that is the movement away from a focus on the primitive African, on the peripheral African, to the center or heartland or core of the civilizations, because it is utterly impossible to get a sense or a glimpse of the achievement of a people unless you focus in on the center or core of their civilizations. I was surprised to find that the Wall Street Journal was using the same terms I have been using for the past 7 years. They wrote an article recently talking about the core and periphery of civilizations, which is my thesis, where they pointed out that whereas in the center of Europe, everything seems to be so remarkably advanced, technologically advanced, if one went on the periphery of Europe, one would find extremely backward, poverty-stricken communities. I have been saying that for a long time. Nobody writes about those communities. I have lived in those communities, not just passed through. I've lived in both Western and Eastern Europe. I've lived behind the Iron Curtain. I've lived in both the communist and the capitalist worlds. And I have lived in villages in Europe where they have never seen a black man in all history. Because most of us think that all Europe was engaged in the slave trade. It was not. It was Western European powers. Many peoples in Europe have never seen blacks. Not since the early, very, very early, many thousands of years ago, the very early era when blacks crossed into Europe. And that is where, in fact, any study of the African and early Europe begins. Because we must understand that man was born in Africa. This now is accepted, but that was not accepted for quite a long while. People were searching for man, early man in Asia, early man in the Middle East, that so-called Middle East, Palestine, and so forth. But man was born in Africa. There is no doubt about that. Now, All the stages of man are found in Africa, right through until we find modern man with the present cranium of modern man, etc. So there are no Europeans on the earth when man is born. There are no Asiatics, there is just man who is African. Man is born in Africa, therefore the first man is African. And you have movements, waves of people coming out of Africa, crossing into Europe and crossing into Asia. And when you go, therefore, the first paintings in Europe, the first cave dwellers, the first paintings of Europe, the first art, the first tools, etc., they are African. We find African women crossing over 5,000 miles of Europe. We find all the pictures of our Europeans are African women. We find also that when we go to the earliest strata or layer in Europe, we find African skeletons, the structure of the bones, the structure of the nose, etc. It all shows there's the African. Therefore, there are no Europeans. Africans are 3.5 million years old. Europeans are only about 50 to 60,000 years old. And I was very struck many years ago, although I didn't know these facts then, when I attended a poets' conference in Wales, in Cardiff, I think it was, with some of the great African poets, Wole Soyinka of Nigeria, and another gentleman who is now dead. And Australians, New Zealanders, and other members of the white Commonwealth would get up and say, the younger members of the Commonwealth. I remember being very annoyed about that and saying, who are you calling younger members? In what sense are we younger? Because that is one of the theses that the Negro, the so-called Negro, is only 10,000 years old. He's the last, he's the youngest, and that's why he's so stupid. Man was born in Africa. There is no 10,000-year-old Negro. In fact, as I was to learn after many years in British anthropology, there is no Negro. The Africoid, as we shall now call him, and as we have been calling him in the journal, the African type, moves up into Europe. But first, that type is not a very advanced type. Neanderthal man or Neanderthaloid man has something slightly missing. It's some sort of lobe, the seat of the imagination. He is replaced by an advanced African type known as the Grimaldi. That advanced African type spreads all over Africa and goes up into Europe and goes up into parts of Asia. That type is known as the Homo sapiens sapiens. That is modern man. There is no inferiority or superiority in races because that is the type from which they all evolved. Somewhere around 50,000 years ago, some people put it slightly earlier, during what is known as the worm stadial, it's a period in the Ice Age, you have a body of black people are locked into an area known as Eurasia, which covers a part of modern Russia. They are in the ice, vast sheets of ice. Some of them a mile thick cover Europe in this period. It's a very unusual period. The African is separated from the sun in this period. In Europe, he's completely separated from the sun. He's living largely in caves. He covers his flesh with the hides of animals, so that he has several things protecting him from the sun. First of all, the sun is far away. He hardly ever sees it. The sunlight is tangential, feeble. Furthermore, he's in a cave most of the time, and again, he's covered with the hides of animals. As a consequence, the albino, which is a deviant, begins to emerge because blacks give birth to albinos, who are pigmentless humanoids. So you have the pigmented human, which is the African, giving birth to a pigmentless type, which at first is just a deviant. Now this happens in Africa even today. Black people give birth to white people. White in the sense that they have no pigment. Okay? But the albino does not survive in Africa. No albino lives more than about 30 years in Africa. It is an extreme deviation, and you cannot survive with the intensity of the ultraviolet radiation in great tropical latitudes, okay? Hence, the albino would die out in Africa. The albino does not die in Europe. The albino can live in an ice-cold climate, does not suffer that disadvantage. So that albino type survives and begins to make other types that are pigmentless. The pigmentless type becomes stabilized because in the extreme ice, because of the great shadows, the long twilight, this man lives for about 10,000 years in the twilight, far away from the sun. The ice people stabilize the albino type so that you get a great number of people eventually being born in that area who are pigmentless. That is, their hair and their skin loses this melanin shield, which is necessary, absolutely necessary in the tropics. Then you have other changes, contraction of the nose, contraction of various aspects of the face because of the cold. Heat tends to expand, therefore you have people with broader noses, fuller lips, broader cheekbones likely in the tropics, whereas you have contracted noses, contracted faces in the ice, so that you have distinction between ice people and the sun people. These are very superficial things. We have invested them with something far more than superficial because our society has become so highly polarized and people think strictly in terms of white and black. These things have become tremendously important, especially within the last 500 years when people's worth, value, humanity have been determined by how contracted or expanded their noses and whether they're pigmentless or pigmented, which in nature is quite meaningless. Okay, but in our societies, these things have come to have a meaning. We find that black type did not simply die out, did not disappear, because now that we begin to scratch the surfaces of history, we are finding extraordinary things. We find, for example, and you can see pictures of it in this book, a black king in Britain. There is a picture in that book where you find a black king and a black male king and a pale-skinned a pale-skinned queen in Britain. You also find Thorstein, a Norseman, being black. You hear of this tall giant black Thorstein. You find a Viking king being black. You also find one of the kings of Ireland, Gormund, is a black king. So that you go through Ireland, you find that the Africans have taken over part of Ireland. You go into Greenland. When Eric the Red went into Greenland, he found blacks in Greenland. You find blacks in Ireland. You find blacks in Britain. Claudian, the historian, commenting on the victory of Theodosius, the Roman general in Britain, he said he defeated the blackamoors. A great number of the people living then in Britain were black. These are absorbed, as I say, and as over a period of time, these types are absorbed by the pale skin type, which becomes the dominant type in Europe, particularly during and after the Ice Age. That becomes the dominant type because that is the more adapted type in that climate. But it took a long time. It's not something that happens just like that. For example, white people in Africa don't turn black, and black people in Europe don't turn white. These are special circumstances and conditions that happen within a particular period of time. Okay, so don't misunderstand that there's a tendency, as long as you stay in Europe, to become white, as long as you stay in Africa, to become black. Okay, it's not as simple as that. Those are very special types of mutations that occur during very special periods, climatological extremes. But let us move away from that. What we do know in that period, which is known as the Paleolithic, the Stone Age, we have major contributions by Africans to Europe. The first pendants, the first jewelry, the first tools, the first burial practices. This is very important because the Cro-Magnon man who did not have more sedentary habits, that is like agricultural or tendency to settle and to have agriculture, etc., he burnt his dead as he moved on. Whereas Africans introduced burial, the burial of the dead, the burial of the human dead into introduced various things. Some musical instruments were introduced in that period. We pass on to the civilization because that is most significant. While we do know the first man is African, and we have now a tremendous body of things developing to show how come the melanin shield is dropped in some certain places, producing the pigmentless type with the different hair and skin, different eyes, all of which are colorations, and then you get also other things in the climate producing a different texture of hair, a lankiness versus a tightness, and various kinds of lengths and things like that in terms of hair. All of these things can be explained in terms of climate. But when we come to civilizations, it has been said, okay, fine, all right, even if we were to admit that the black is the first man and that he did move up into Europe. After all, Europe did not have the Straits of Gibraltar then. You could cross by land. It's only 20 miles between Africa and Europe. They're very close to each other. The southernmost tip of Europe and the northernmost tip of Africa, you could walk across it within less than a day, okay? Even if you have the Straits of Gibraltar, you could easily cross over. So we do know of these waves of Africans going up into Europe, waves of Africans going up into India. But then comes the question, okay, fine. But then people say, all right, so you may have been the father of the European, but then what did you do? The European got smart, and he built all the civilizations, and he came back and civilized you. Those people who stayed, they just merely deteriorated, and those people who moved into new regions, they made all the great advances. That is not true. Because when we go into the early civilizations, and we're not talking about primitives now, we're not talking about first man now, we're talking about the first civilizations, the advanced cultures of the world, we find the black again at the beginning of those civilizations. We go into Crete, Minoan Crete, and you will find pictures there of a black in charge of the Minoan army. You find pictures there of many of the Cretans are black. And you find Crete is very important because, in case you don't know, Crete was to have a profound influence on Greece. Greece was to be the very flower and quintessence of European civilization. And there, Evans and Schliemann, these are the two greatest European excavators of Crete. And both of them are saying this is a black civilization. Both of them come to that conclusion. I remember some years ago, John Papademos, the Greek physicist, who's a very good friend of mine, he'd written a major article in the Blacks in Science issue. When he speaks, most of his colleagues walk out. They can't stand him because he has spent most of his lifetime to establish that Greek science, the so-called miraculous Greek science, is only partially Greek science. A lot of it is African science brought over from Egypt into Greece and claimed to be Greek. He has had the honesty to show how much his countrymen in history owed to the Africa. And he was in Crete for a year, and he wrote me a letter urgently, please tell me what to look for. I'm in Crete for a whole year, and I want to study anything that is African in Crete. And I put him in touch with various people who knew something about Crete, because this is not something I was studying at the time. And he came back with quite a lot of material. We have James Bronson, a very fine black artist in Chicago, who's given us a lot of pictures on Crete. One of the things I found astonishing about James Bronson, though, is that he always keeps his best pictures back. I was doing something for Gil Noble, it's not finished yet, an African presence in Asia. And when we came to China, all James Bronson had, for example, the Chu dynasty in China is all black. In fact, they call it Naqi, which means black man. So the Chang dynasty is black. And when we had to study that, we found we didn't have very good pictures. Just had a few primitive types or semi-primitive types. And then when I wrote James Bronson, I said, please send me more pictures. He sent me 6 pictures of African noblemen in the court of China. I said, don't you think that is important? He said, you didn't ask me for it. We have a wealth of things. You cannot imagine what incredible photographs exist, what incredible paintings exist from early times. On the cover of this book, which is just released, for example, are two African noblemen playing chess in 12th century Spain, right in the heart of Europe. And this is very difficult to find these things because one of the problems that we face when we come to deal with some black types in Europe like the Moors is that the Muslims had a thing against making images. It was sacrilegious, so that most of the paintings are done by outsiders. So the Moors themselves seldom painted themselves or represented themselves, so that we have a problem there. And in spite of that, we still have some very remarkable surviving paintings of Moors in Europe. But let me not touch on the Moors. Let me touch on Greece. Greece is the very center, as Egypt is, so is Greece to Europe. When we go back to the early history of Africa, when we go back to the foundation of African civilizations, Egypt is the flower, it is the fountainhead of African civilization. And there is now no doubt whatsoever as to who founded Egypt. Do not confuse the modern Egyptians with the ancient Egyptians. The modern Egyptians are not black. You will find some blacks among the modern Egyptians. Sadat, when he was here, Sadat said, I am a black man, and I'm the first true pharaoh in 2,000 years. He was speaking the truth because Sadat himself has Sudanic origins. Many people in his cabinet do not. Abdullah, for example, an Egyptian, when we had the Cairo conference in 1974, and Sheikh Anta Diop, the greatest of the Africanists, we call him the Pharaoh of African Studies, and by the way, we're bringing out a special book on Diop in the spring called Dr. Diop in America. And when Diop proved beyond a shadow of a doubt, he took skin from the mummies in the Maritime excavations and tested them for melanin content and showed that they were African. And he showed that Herodotus and a whole range of people said they were black skinned. Abdullah, the modern Egyptian, jumped up and said, even if they're black skinned, they're white. And I heard this recently. You would think that is ridiculous. I was on the radio in New Orleans, and I started talking about Egyptians, and a white professor got on the air and he said, how could you after all the evidence has been presented that these are white Hamites, how could you call them, they're just tan, how could you call these tan Caucasoids black? And I said, but Herodotus said they were black skinned. He said, yes, but they were Hamites. I said, I don't care what you call yourself, sir. This is not a minstrel show. You cannot put on black skin and woolly hair in order to claim my civilization. You've done too much of that. Every time there is something remarkable in Africa, it's a Hamite or a Semite or some kind of mite, okay, that seems to get involved in creating it. This is true of everything, even when we come to Ghana, ancient Ghana. They say it is some Arab came in, some pale-skinned Arab came in to found Ghana. If you go to the Southern African Empire, Monomotapa, they say the Portuguese built those remarkable structures. The Portuguese built it, the Phoenicians built it, the Chinese built it, the Arabs built it. You go to the Arab world, you go to China, you go to Portugal, you can't find anything like it. When they find the pyramids and they see this enormous, when the French came, they saw the tremendous Sphinx. The Sphinx is the largest representation of a human in the world. Broad nose, broad mouth, broad brow, broad everything, like the authority of a black god brooding down on the French. They took the cannon and blew off his nose. And then they have to when they see the pyramids and the extraordinary, they see the race of pyramid builders came in and built it. Well, if they are a race of pyramid builders, where are their pyramids? There's always this attempt. I said, have you seen the evidence? Have you seen the latest evidence of Tarseti? Do you know they don't know anything about Tarseti? Do you know in the latest Journal of Asiatic Studies, there's a man who's trying to prove that Bruce Williams, who discovered Tarseti, is a fraud and that there is no such evidence? They can't deal with that. It has to be a fraud it has to be non-existent because they have to revise completely their view of the world. That is why history is very important. This is revolutionary stuff because it is at the very center. This is striking at the pillars of this civilization. Because civilizations are built up by the way people think about the world. That's what a civilization fundamentally is. It's not just a technology, it's a way of thinking. That is the reason why a technology can become death dealing rather than life creating, because it has to do with the thought process. Civilizations are built up by certain thought processes, and the thought process behind this civilization is rooted in falsehoods so grave that when those falsehoods are threatened, it becomes a very serious matter. It's worse than taking guns and start shooting everybody down, because you're really striking at something that could get, if you start shooting, you can't get very far. But this is the kind of silent bullet that after years begins to split people's minds open. Most civilizations have collapsed from inside because of silent bullets presented by new thoughts, a new way of looking at the world, a new vision. These facts have been suppressed for centuries. How many of us know of a black king in Ireland? He's right there. There's in books and books. It's not something discovered yesterday. How many of us know of a black Viking? How many of us know that the Celts were described as black-bearded, black-skinned, black-eyed? I had to speak to the Early Science Research Society just a month or two ago. I was speaking to them. This is a totally white, that's the first time that I was speaking to them, and they have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that there were Celts in America before Columbus, but they don't know that the Celts are not white. They have proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that Egyptians were here before Columbus, but they don't know that Egyptians are not white. They think that by proving that they have established that there were other Europeans in America before Columbus. There were, but they weren't in the positions of ascendancy as the Egyptians. And it took quite a while to explain to them what had been happening in the field of African civilization that establishes the blackness of early Egyptian civilization. You know, Mrs. Sadat was very annoyed that a black man played Sadat in the television series. You know that program was banned in Egypt. So don't confuse it's like confusing the modern American with the ancient American. There are no Americans in this room. There may be one or two people with streaks of American Indian blood like myself. I have a streak of Makusi Indian, but we are all African or European or Asiatic. The American is in the reservations or he's in parts of South America. The same thing is true in Egypt. You do have blacks still, but he's become peripheral because you have many invasions of Egypt. Egypt has been invaded by the Syrians, the Western Asiatics, who defeated the blacks around 663 and 654 BC. Then it was invaded by the Persians on the Cambyses in 520 BC. Then it was invaded by the Greeks on the Alexander 320 BC. Then it was invaded by the Romans just before and after Christ, the Caesars. Then it was invaded by the Arabs, who now occupy and dominate it. They have nothing to do with the pyramids. Absolutely nothing. They were startled when they walked in there and saw those pyramids. Startled by that science. And the Greeks, you cannot imagine how many of the great names. G.G.M. James, a fellow Guyanese, wrote a book called The Stolen Legacy, which is reviewed here. He points to the doctrines that the Greeks owe to the Africans. Do you know the Africans were the first to develop an atomic theory? That the greatest of European scientists, Isaac Newton, who we recently discovered was studying the Egyptian documents. Papademos had shown, for example, in a major article recently in the book I edited, Nile Valley Civilizations, that Kepler and Copernicus and all of Galileo and all of these people had read Egyptians and passed all bits and pieces down to Newton. He was able to bring about a new synthesis as a result of his genius. But now we're finding that he didn't even have to read these guys. He was an Egyptologist himself. He was reading everything they'd done, and he himself said that the Africans in Egypt were the first to develop an heliocentric theory of the universe, heliocentric theory of this solar system, that the earth revolves around the sun. They were the first to develop an atomic theory they call atoms monads. They didn't reach the state of nuclear fission, that is recent, but they had an atomic theory. They had a sense that the world, the foundation stone, the building block of the universe was the atom. All that long, long before Christ. We're only now becoming aware of that, the impact on the medicine, on the science of the world through the Greeks, because Greece was to become the foundation stone of European civilization. Through Greece, all these things were to come down. Men like Anaximander, Anaximenes, Pythagoras, Xenophanes, Zeno, Heraclitus, Anaxagoras, Democritus, Plato, Aristotle, all of these guys were drawing heavily on African materials. And the next thing you hear, they're the father of this, the inventor of this, the creator of this. They were not without genius. These men had their own genius. But they could not have made the strides they made unless they had built upon a foundation that went back for centuries in Africa. And this was not the only thing that was to happen in that respect. We have several races that are found running through the various European tribes. The Twa, for example, of Africa, we find them far up, right up into Greenland. They found people called the Skrælings, who are black. In Greenland, the Arctic Circle, the top of the world. When Eric the Reed walked into Greenland, he found black people. As I said, when Theodosius the Roman attacked Britain, they found some of the people who were fighting them were blacks. You find in the religious hierarchy of Europe a great number of blacks. And here I want to mention someone to whom this book is dedicated, Professor Edward Scobie. Professor Scobie has done more work in this field than anyone I know. He is responsible for 3 articles in this book: Black Women in Europe, The Black in Western Europe, and African Popes. Few of us are aware of the African popes. There were at least 3 African popes of Rome. All of them have been whitened and whitewashed over the years. He presents us, for example, with the original painting of Pope Miltiades. There is no doubt about the blackness of this Pope. The only thing non-black about him, it was his gray hair and the whiteness of his eyes. Yet when you see him in the Vatican, he's white. I mean, surely the church knew that they were lying. I mean, how come these things are covered up? As soon as that era of slavery entered, the black had to be diminished in order to make it work. Because the Christian conscience could not carry the horror of knowing that if the black was really equal, how could you be treating him like that? He had to be an inferior. Only then you can carry that kind of conscience. Only then you can sleep at night. You have to think that the person you're mistreating and dehumanizing is not really human. And it affected everything. People have to find reasons for things. That is the reason why the black was, whenever you saw the black in some prominent places, he was put down. And yet in the church, the black had tremendous influence. Many saints are black. Saint Maurice, the patron saint of Germany, is black. It's only just before Hitler's time he was removed from patron sainthood. You find the Madonnas running their brilliant pictures of the black Madonnas. Now they have European faces. The child still retains its Africanness. Many of the black Madonnas have European faces, but they keep their blackness, because when you go back to the original black Madonna, Isis and Horus, you see the African mother and child. And after the death of Jesus, that is how Jesus and Mary was represented, as a black mother and child. We do not know that Jesus was black, but we know that he had African blood, because when we see his first physical representation on a coin at the back of Justinian II in the 2nd century AD, you could see he has dark brown skin and he has woolly hair like that of an African. His nose is not African. It's a Semitic type nose. It's whatever you mean by Semitic, but it's not a broad nose. But he's obviously mixed. But he's not European. The only time Christ got to confront Europeans is the day he was arrested. Yet when he appears on the cross, he is blue-eyed with blonde hair. Where did he get that from? He spent his boyhood in Africa. At least until he was 12, he's there sitting among the doctors in Egypt. He was sent there, Hosea says quite clearly, out of Egypt shall I call my son. He was brought back out and brought in to serve his ministry. And even if in the search of Jeremiah's search for the historical Jesus and other works that have been done, they still come back to an Egyptian source. Jesus is the last and the most powerful and the most remarkable of the Christ. But you have the Christ figure appearing in Egypt, in Africa, before Jesus is born. Christ, in fact, is an African word, karast. Karast means the anointed one. That's an Egyptian word. Someone asked me on the radio this afternoon whether Africa is a word that Europeans made up. No, sir. Europe is an African word. It comes from an African princess, Europa. Africa was not made up by Europeans. Africa comes from an African word. Africa is an Egyptian word meaning birthplace. Okay, please note that. Because I'm not saying that other people didn't have words for parts of Africa, because several people have presented theories about other words, and there may be other words. People do not usually name their continents because they don't think of them as continents. It's only within fairly recent times that we have started to think of places as continents. Okay? It is very important to note that it is only recently, for example, that we began to think of ourselves as planet Earth. Earth doesn't mean anything, it's just a name. Okay, so that you can't call yourself Africa because you can't conceive of all Africa. Those are recent events. You can't conceive of all Europe. You can't conceive of America. So Americans can't call themselves Americans because they can't see the whole continent. Okay, so they're usually people from outside give a name and that name sticks. Okay, like Egypt, for example, is not the name given by the Egyptians. The name given by the Greeks, but it sticks because the Greeks were to become very important, etc. So there are other names for Egypt. You don't get involved in the names because it's still the same place once we know what we're talking about. It's very important to note about the popes. In Scobie's article, we learn of 3 great African popes. They are not just African, they did have significant impact because St. Victor, for example, who's from 189 to 197 AD, he was the person to force an observance of Easter on Sunday by both the European Christians as well as the Asiatic Christians, because I think one of them observed it on another day and he had to bring it in line. Then St. Miltiades, whom I just mentioned, from 311 to 314 AD, he reigned as Pope during the most significant moment in Christianity. This is when the Roman Emperor Constantine became converted to Christianity and gave back a lot of the property of the church back into the hands of the African who restored it. Today, the Vatican and all many of those places were given back to the church. And then there's St. Gelasius, who is responsible for Candlemas, many hymns and collects, the feast of the purification and things like that. So you do have African popes, and you do have a profound influence on the Madonnas. The most saintly figures, the most worshipped, the most venerated figures in Europe are black Madonnas. And this brings us to something that is very interesting, the strange contradiction of the European imagination in relation to the black. Okay, particularly black women, where you find that black women are worshipped from very early by Europeans. The goddess of wisdom is black. Minerva, the goddess of chastity, is black. Artemis. Circe, the great enchantress who drew Odysseus and his crew, she is black. You find Andromeda. Some of you may have heard of the great Greek myth of and Perseus and Andromeda. Perseus is the great Greek hero, and he marries Andromeda. When you see it on TV, of course, she's white. But Andromeda is black. You will see it in the book Black Women in Antiquity. You will see how they are represented by the early Greeks. In fact, the early Greeks never contested that blacks had a profound influence on them. Martin Bernal, who is a classical scholar at Cornell, wrote a brilliant article called Black Athena, the African and Levantine Roots of Greece, where he showed that there was first of all what is known as the ancient model. The Greeks said that Africans gave them most of their gods. Africans influenced them in many ways, and Herodotus and the whole range of them, Euripides, Aeschylus, etc., all admitted that Egyptians had profound influence on them. It is later on, when it was not fashionable for blacks to have anything to do with anything, then they changed it around to an Aryan model. The Europeans felt that they were demeaning their ancestors by saying they owed all of this to the blacks, so they pulled that out of it and created their own model and said Greece must be Aryan because the language is Aryan. The language is Aryan, yes, it is Aryan in its structure, but there are 50% masses of things, the place names and the gods and a whole range of lexical items come from outside, and many of them come from African and Semitic sources, and Martin Bernal has tracked that down. So it's not just the sciences, but many of the concepts and even the language was profoundly affected by the impact of the older African civilizations on the younger European civilization. This is very important because this is one of the reasons why we became slaves. That the European, because of his youth and because of his lack of experience in taking over things, he sought it through his insecurity to destroy everything he found. Africans didn't do that. When the Africans entered Europe as Moors, they didn't try to smash European culture. They introduced better things, and the Europeans adopted it, but they didn't try deliberately to smash everything they found. The Europeans did that everywhere. Here in America, Bishop Landon ordered all the books in America to be burned. He said, burn them all. They're works of the devil. They were the only people to have the truth. Everybody else was the devil. They burnt all the books. They did the same thing with the same arrogance when they defeated the Moors in Spain. Masses of documents at a time when we didn't have the printing press. It was only recently in the 15th century the printing press was invented. And at the time when books were one of a kind, sometimes it would take a century to produce the knowledge. I mean, it takes centuries to produce a book like that, because that book, African Presence in Northern Europe, draws upon all that we know, going right back to the beginning of time of the African presence in Europe. Now that book can't be destroyed because it can run into thousands or millions of copies. It can't be destroyed because if you destroy one, somebody somewhere has one. But if in early times you destroy a book like that, that's it. Because it's not reproduced. So that when you hear the Library of Alexandria destroyed, or the libraries of America is destroyed, the libraries of the Moors are destroyed, centuries are destroyed. Centuries of knowledge are destroyed. That is the reason we have had so painfully to piece together the scattered parts of our heritage. This is not as easy as European history. European history, in spite of all the wars in Europe, European archives have been fairly well preserved. They have not been dominated by people that arrogant or that insecure as to tear their things to pieces. Yet they've done that to other people. That is the reason why it's taken so long before we reach that point where we're able to pull the strands together. But they're coming together now, make no mistake about it. We begin to see now with a new clarity, a new depth, a new certainty, the things that have been hidden, suppressed, or scattered all over the world. The imagination of the European, we find, is very contradictory in relation to black women. He makes the black women goddesses. There's Andromeda, there's Medea, there's Circe, there's Artemis, there is Minerva and all of these. And yet, he also thinks of her as a courtesan. He has tremendous sexual attraction to the black women. Thus it is that many of the kings of Europe have black mistresses. The Portuguese kings, for example, many of them, as Scobie has shown, several of the Portuguese kings end up with African-type features. There's all sorts of secret things going on. And in Italy, for example, one of the popes has a black child. When he's Cardinal de' Medici, he has an affair with his black servant, and then he produces a black child and he makes him ruler of Florence, the Duke of Florence. You find one of the queens of France, her husband has a black mistress, so she takes vengeance on him and has a black lover. And then a black child is born, and he is startled by this, and he turns to the doctors and says, how could I, this is King Louis XIV, how could I give birth to a black child? And the doctor said, you see that black man in your coat, Nabo? When your wife was pregnant, you must have looked at her and the child turned black. And the king said it must have been a very penetrating look. Well, that led, and there are brilliant pictures of the black nun of Moray. That led to the nun of Moray. She was put in a monastery to protect the royal family from scandal, and she was kept there for most of her life. The Duke of Chartres fell in love with her and tried to smuggle her out of the monastery, but he couldn't get the permission of the king, and so eventually he had to return her, and in the monastery she died. You have also quite a number of famous individuals who were adopted by European kings. By the way, many of the poets also were in love with black women. Shakespeare had a black mistress, Lucy Negro. Baudelaire, the greatest French poet, had a black mistress. In fact, I think she inspired a great deal of his work. And you also find the traction. Napoleon once said the only way to solve the racial question is that you should have a white wife, a black wife, and a mulatto. Well, he could have neither black wife nor white wife, so he picked a mulatto and made her queen. He picked a woman from the Caribbean. So you have a lot of this going on, and it affects the royal family. You have one of the queens of Britain, Queen Charlotte Sophia, who has black blood. You can see quite clearly in her features. You also have a number of the European kings adopting black children. So, for example, Abraham Petrovich Hannibal, not to be confused with the Hannibal of Carthage. He's given this name. He's a slave in Constantinople, and the Tsar of Russia adopts him, and he becomes very important. He becomes one of the generals in the Russian army. He also becomes an architect. He also becomes a diplomat. He has diplomatic mission with Sweden. He also helps to build various things. And then his grandson is Pushkin. Pushkin was the greatest of authors, the greatest poet of his day. He had a profound influence on the Russian language, and he was the black descendant of Abraham Petrovich Hannibal. Many of these people are mentioned, but I want to come to something that interests me most of all, because it was to have the profoundest impact on what we know today as the Industrial Revolution. Few of us are aware that the greatest influence blacks have had on Europe came with the Moors. Who are the Moors? When did they enter Europe? What did they do? What was their impact on Europe? First of all, the word Moor was used by the Romans, mores, dark or black, coming from moros, meaning dark or black by the Greeks. And they used it when, in 46 BC, they came into West Africa and they saw black people and they called them Moors. So, but that doesn't answer our question fully. It shows the origin of the word, but that word was used for various ethnic types. We do have two types of Moors. We have the black Moors, which are large extent originate among the Garamantes, who appear around 6000 BC. They spread over a great body of northern Africa. They are black types. But we also have a fair-skinned Moor. The Libyan, because some of the Libyans, James Bronson has shown to be dark-skinned. Some of the Libyans, Chandler has shown to be fair-skinned. Like you do have a type that is known as Tamahu. Tama means people, hue means like ivory. That is the color of the skin. White people or people of ivory skin. So you do have some Libyans who are surrounded by black populations and intermix with them. So that you have Moors, white Moors that intermix with blacks. They are known as the tawny Moors, and you have the black Moors. So you have a body of people like that. When the real story of the Moors begins seriously when Muhammad is born. Muhammad is an Arab. He preaches a new doctrine which attracts a great number of people. One of the things remarkable about Muhammad is that he did not seek to destroy the Christian thing. He embraced Jesus, he embraced Moses, because Muslims can embrace Jesus and Moses. It's not a religion that seeks to destroy the other religion or to deny it. So Jesus and Moses are in the Islamic thing. The Islamic pantheon, they're considered as important prophets in the Islamic pantheon, so that he didn't have to destroy the Christian thing. Also, Muhammad preached equality and brotherhood, etc., and that had quite an effect. But like Christ, Muhammad was a revolutionary, and he faced the hostility of some of his own people. Christ was not liked by the Jewish high priests, because many of them believed certain things which Christ placed into question. Okay, Jesus said things like Mosaic law, or Moses says an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, but I say, if my brother offends thee 70 times 7, forgive him. Various things like that, which brought a new vision of the human. Jesus transcended race. He transcended the limitations, the tribal pettiness of the Judaic sect. Okay, therefore, Jew or no Jew, he transcended the Jew. Muhammad is the same, Arab or no Arab, he transcended the petty, warring, semi-primitive Arab tribes of his time. The greatness of these men lies in their universality of spirit, their ability to stand above littleness of their time or the littleness of their people, to rise above those things and to establish an idea, a vision that would embrace the world, that would give man a new chance to become something, to become a new man, to build a new world. So that even though Christ was crucified and Muhammad was chased out. For example, Muhammad, the years of the Muslim world begin with the Hijrah, the flight of Muhammad. In both cases, both prophets were embraced by the blacks. Jesus fled to Egypt when he was threatened by Herod. He spent 12 years in Africa, in a village called Marathia, near Heliopolis. And in fact, the first converted people who built the first great Christian churches are in Ethiopia. They're not in Rome, not in Europe. Europe came after. Europeans, in fact, although it wasn't, as Pontius Pilate said, it wasn't his fault, he washed his hands of the whole affair, because when he said, "Look, I have found this man innocent, here is Barabbas," the crowd said, "No, we want Jesus." So that in a sense, the Romans were not fully responsible for the execution of Jesus, it was his own people. But nevertheless, Rome did not come to Christ easily. It is the Ethiopians who built the first Christian churches. Let us remember that. When we see all of these blonde-haired and blue-eyed Christs, which were created afterwards. There is no harm in creating God in your own image. That you have all right to do. The sin lies in trying to push that down other people's throats as though it's the literal truth. To make us believe that Jesus is white. To make us believe that we have to bow down to a white image of humanity. Because this was part of the way of keeping us in our place. And this must be understood. With Muhammad's death came the Great Crusades. However, with his death came a division among the Muslims, which is very tragic and which in fact is going to haunt them for a long time. Because the Sunnites and the Shiites began to fight among each other. There were those who believed that Muhammad should be succeeded through an election. Those who believed he should be succeeded through that who was nearest in blood. and fights began between the Shiites and the one who believed in heredity versus the one who believed, the Sunnis who believed in election. This is going to become very important because you're going to see what effect it's going to have on the Moors. These Arabs now, they move out, they move into China, they move into India, they come down into Africa, and they begin to mix with the Africans. So that you have a lot of conversion occurring, and then the Africans begin to build something with the Islamic thing uniting them, just as other Europeans began to build with the Christian thing uniting them. Bear in mind, this has nothing to do with race, okay, because Jesus wasn't a European, yet he helped to unite Europe. Muhammad was not an African, yet he helped to unite Africa, because these things, these ideas are universal, they have universal application. And it's not where they begin, but what impact they have on the world. Very important to understand that there was something growing up in Africa, the Muslim thing was spreading all over the world, and then the North Africans under Musa bin Nasir, they were consolidating themselves, but they could not take all of North Africa because there was a tremendous fortress defended by Count Julian. And Count Julian was a friend of the Visigoths in Spain. These were Christian, so-called Christians, Visigoth Vandals in Spain, who were ruling at the time under King Roderick. However, Count Julian shifted and gave the Africans and Arabs his support because he sent his virgin daughter to the court of Spain, and Roderick ravished her. And to take revenge, he then gave boats to the Africans, and they crossed the straits and they marched up. First, Tarif went up. That word is remembered in our language whenever you hear of tariffs, duties on goods. That comes from an African named Tarif, who was the first to lead the troops into Europe. He came back, and then came Tariq, and Gebel Tariq, the rock of Tariq, which later became known as Gibraltar. And then in 711, many African troops, along with Arabian types, but the majority of the shock troops were African, moved up into Europe, and they established their bases in Spain and part of Portugal, etc. They were repulsed by General Martel in parts of France, but they established a center in Europe. And the Africans were able to establish a dynasty with the Arabs. And when I say Arab, I have to use this word carefully, because an Arab could be black or he could be blue-eyed. Okay, it's not a race, it's just like the Jew. You have black Jews and you have white Jews. At the beginning, it is almost all black Jews. Within recent times, most of the Jews are white. Okay, so that it is not a race. Okay, but nevertheless, many people speaking Arabic are called Arab, but we can make a distinction between the Arabian type and the African type. In the first dynasties, the Umayyad dynasty, for example, the Arabian type is dominant, or no, not dominant in numbers, dominant politically because he has his base outside, and he has his thing stretching out into China, India, etc. But in other dynasties, the African is very dominant. He isn't just there, but he's dominant. There are 4 major dynasties in Europe which are called Moorish dynasties. There's the Umayyad dynasty, which is followed by the Abbasid dynasty, which is followed by the Almoravid dynasty, which is followed by the Almohade dynasty. Almoravid dynasty and Almohade dynasty are African. Almoravid and Almohade are predominantly African. And you can see that quite clearly. The fights begin first, Umayyad dynasty set up, and then the Shiites and the Sunnites start to fight, and they kill 70 members of the royal family and execute the Caliph, which is the sort of king, and the Umayyad dynasty goes down for a while, and then the Abbasids come up, and then the Abbasids are pushed out, the Umayyads come back again, and then when they start to weaken in Europe, then you find Africans are keeping courts both in Africa and in Europe. In Africa, a new movement forms, and a new religious sect with great power under Yusuf moves up into Europe and takes over and strengthens. And and then you find Almohades later on. When they fall into decline, another force from Africa comes through. So the replenishment of civilization, or these civilized forces and armies, comes from Africa. Now what did they do? Many people have written books about the Moors, and they could tell you all about these dynasties, but they never tell you how African they were. I mean, in the Almohade and Almoravid dynasties, you have ranges. I mean, there's a period in African history and in European history where there are tall Senegalese sitting on white steeds charging in Europe. Europeans charging down. Europeans fled like if the devils were after them. Very few of us learn of those battles. Few of us know of that, and it was a profound influence on Europe. It was so profound that the Industrial Revolution, the thrust of Spain and Portugal, because America was largely Spanish, even today, and Portugal controls Brazil, those things were possible because of Africans. No other part of Europe made those first thrusts. Those things were possible because of movements by Africans into Europe, because Europe was suffering tremendously there was tremendous twilight on the science of Europe. Many things that had been learned by the Greeks and Romans were lost. The Europeans had become very superstitious when the Arabs and Africans got the Hindu ciphers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Europeans wouldn't accept it because the European church said numbers are works of the devil. Europeans were using letters for numbers. You see, all that is universal today. You think it came out of Europe. The very things that were to defeat the Africans and the Americans, the gunpowder and the artillery, were not invented by Europeans. Gunpowder came out of China. The Arabs brought it out. The Muslims brought it out of China and brought it into Europe. Europeans didn't know anything about gunpowder. The Africans had been using gunpowder in Egypt, though not for the purpose of firing. They use it for certain effects. We have recently found the West Africans had gunpowder before the Europeans. They were not using it for fire sticks. They were using it for other purposes. And now we find artillery. The recent Leningrad manuscript, Russian manuscript, showed the first use of artillery by the Muslims. Europeans didn't know anything about artillery. All of these things were to come into their hands because of the trust of Arabs and Africans into Europe. Africans and Arabs brought the whole wealth, because Arabs had invaded Egypt, brought the whole wealth of Egyptian science. The Dar al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Cairo, all the science that was going on at the time, translated into Arabic, then into Spanish, then into Latin, circulating in Europe. Europe had no proper universities, they only had two. The Africans and Arabs built a whole range of universities. They built the first public baths. Some of them are still standing today. They've introduced air conditioning in Europe, and their air conditioning was superior to some of our air conditioning because they would bring the air over the banks of perfume flowers so that the air in the house would be fresh. All those things they introduced, they took water in pipes and ran it from the mountains right into the houses. They introduced the first sewage system, they introduced hot and cold water. You never hear about these things. Europeans don't talk about that. You never hear anything about these debts and contributions. Even the ships, this is the most important thing. Without those ships, they wouldn't have crossed the Atlantic. The caravel, which was used by the Portuguese and the Spanish, comes from the caravos, which were used by Arabs and Africans. Comes from the pangalos on the Indian Ocean, used again by Arabs and Africans. The sails that Vespucci and Columbus used were Arab Latin sails used by Arabs and Africans on the Indian Ocean. The compass was not developed in Europe. It came out of various uses in China and in Africa. In Africa, they found the caravans. All the caravans had compasses. This is before Europeans started charging into Africa. The astrolabe wasn't developed in Europe. Europe did not make any major significant thrust until with the use of gunpowder and artillery which they had borrowed, with the use of sails and shipping, advanced shipping which they had borrowed, they crossed the seas and start conquering and shooting people down. And then through murder, exploitation, and the lust for greed rather than the lust for God, as they claimed, the thrust brought them out into different situations. Now we ask ourselves, well, if the Africans had all of these things, they did all these marvelous things that were so brilliant, how come the Industrial Revolution occurred in Europe and it didn't occur in Africa? Why did we fall so fast and so easy? First of all, let me point out certain things. Every civilization must know its birth, its rise, and its decline. And then it is followed by another civilization. This is a pattern that happened in Africa, it happened in Asia, it happened in America, it happened in Europe. At the height of the Ghana civilization, for example, Europe couldn't possibly attack. 10,000 troops on the Cromwell defeated the Britons at the time when the Africans could throw 200,000 troops in the field. Nobody attacked the Africans then. Then Ghana went into decline. It was attacked by other forces, not Europeans. And then the Mali civilization came. The Mali civilization was so strong that it was a confederation of powers that would take up all of the states of Western Europe. No people on earth were as rich as the Africans. The Africans were so rich that when one king, Mansa Musa, traveled to Cairo on a pilgrimage in 1234, the value of gold dropped for 12 years in the world. One African king. So the power and wealth of Africa wasn't something that people took for granted. That was real wealth and real power. Then that went into decline, came the Songhai. And the Songhai went into decline, then came the invaders and the traders and all of these people. We were attacked during a twilight period. When Europe was attacked, she was in twilight too, but their twilight was illuminated because we gave libraries, we gave public baths. The first lighted streets in Europe are right there where the Moors were. Many industries were introduced in Europe, and yet the Moors, the older African head, did not seek to destroy what it saw. It built a fusion, it built a marriage of cultures, not the European. When he walked in and smashed everything like Cambyses madly. These are works of the devil, burn them all, and he destroyed ruthlessly the American. Few of you are aware of what happened to the American. It's not just the African. The American died like flies. The diseases of Europe, for example, you talk about AIDS. AIDS is a joke compared to what struck those Americans. The common cold, for example, they had no immunity to the common cold. It was as bad as AIDS. They vanished. In my village, only if you married an African could you live beyond 30 years. American Indians who were pure American Indians died at 30. They were already old at 30. At my age of 50, they would have passed over into the great beyond long ago. So that these things are not understood. The profound internal and external reasons that led to the fall of the Africans. And that fall is not a permanent fall. We are not going to remain forever in decline. Many of us are filled with grave despair because when we look around Africa, we see absolute confusion, famine, disaster on every hand. This is a phase, man. This is not independence. This is just the curtain call. This is not, as Churchill said, this is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. This is just the end of the beginning. We have to think beyond this moment. And to think beyond this moment, we have to build a new strength, a new power, a new courage, a new faith, a new vision. And that can only come by remaking, redeeming, healing our psyche, making it whole again. Not feeling this sense of disintegration and loss, of being scattered and humiliated and broken, by feeling the new power that comes to us when we know that all is not lost. We can still recover. We can still remake this. We can still find again what was lost. This is the beginning, that recreation of the psyche, the creation of a new mind, a new spirit. The physical or the material structures of the world only undergo change when the spiritual or mental structures of the world undergo change. It always begins here. This is the universe. This is the ruling force. And we cannot change that thinking set. We cannot change that force. We cannot give it new power and force to remake our world unless we can draw upon something that feeds and inspires us. We cannot be constantly overwhelmed, as so many of us are, by the apparent gloom and twilight of the present, because there are things beginning to happen. There in South Africa, in spite of all that horror, a year ago, could you imagine South African white businessmen going to talk with guerrilla leaders? Could you imagine the Europeans forced to withdraw all of that money out of South Africa? Could you imagine a run on the rand? It's not over. It has just begun. And this becomes an arm. This becomes a part of that struggle. It cannot simply be a political struggle. It cannot simply be a changing of mask or changing of skins. It has to do with a change of spirit, a change of consciousness. And that change of consciousness can only come through revision and recreation of our history. Therefore, I appeal to you through these works. Think of them not simply as an accumulation of new facts. Think of them as leading to a different kind of spirit, a different kind of world, a different kind of man. Thank you very much.
Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, let's give him another round of applause. Hold on one moment. Brother Charles. To relate to us has added to your storehouse of knowledge and has inspired you to dwell a little bit deeper into the subject of the African presence, not only in Europe but everywhere around the world. I also want to thank you as an audience for being so well behaved and orderly tonight. February 15th. So please take note of that, and I'm sure that you want to come out again and hear some more of his knowledge. And so right now I'd like to turn over the microphone.
Time has come now for questions, so please come up. You see, because you have counters. If a race or a group develops an advantage, they also develop a disadvantage. Okay, like for example, in our present situation, we have certain unrealized capacities. I have never found a black who's been able to use his pineal gland, for example. You see, you may have a potential. A potential does not mean a realization. Okay, the European, for example, may have a potential disadvantage, but it doesn't come out because it is balanced by the fact that he has a historical advantage. Okay, for example, where is the wealth? It's in the European hands. Where is influence? It's in European hands. Where is power? It is in European hands. Where is the technological initiative? It is in European hands. So that even if you may have an advantage, it doesn't make you superior because it is balanced out. Okay, because for example, it has been argued that the black man in America cannot do anything really because from the word go, he most of them grow up in the ghettos. They're brain damaged. They have they get poor food. They operate in very bad ghetto conditions. Therefore, they have brain disadvantages. Now, we don't accept those theories because we know that those things are countered out. So that if you start using the melanin thing, you get into the same problem, because people will say, okay, you may have potential, you may have something in your pineal gland. Show me what you're doing with it. Show me how come that you have, while the European over the last 500 years has created about 1 million inventions, blacks have created about 1,000. So how come his pineal gland, which gives him greater creativity, he didn't create the million? The Europeans created the million and he created the 1,000. Europeans created the million because they're not superior, but because they have an advantage. They were in charge of the world. They went to the universities. They controlled writing. They whipped us down. They kept us and they put us on slave ships, etc. So they have been able to produce and invent more than we have within recent times. Prior to that disadvantaged period, in which they were not in control, we were able to do far more than they. Not because we were superior, but because we were the first, not only as men, we were the first civilizations. We were far in advance of Europeans, so that when Egyptian science struck Greece, for example, the Greeks had, just like today we have to go to European universities because a great deal of African knowledge has been lost. So we have to go to the European universities. The Europeans had to go to the African universities to learn. So you see, the problem that you have to face constantly is that whenever one group secures a certain advantage, it is countered out. It is balanced out by another disadvantage. So that it doesn't make sense to talk about superiority and inferiority, because in the final analysis it has always been found that it is the environment. Like if you develop a new spiritual environment, we can develop a new spiritual environment through our reconstruction of history, which enables us to make certain achievements. But we can't activate the pineal gland. We don't know how to activate the pineal gland, so to talk about it as a special biological advantage would make no sense, because we can't activate it. I mean, potentially it may be such. Let me give you an example of what I mean. I am brain damaged. Nobody would know that. But when I was 9 years old, I was dying, and I had a fever about 107 degrees, which usually kills you. It didn't kill me, it wiped out a part of my brain. There are things that I can do. You could drive a car. If you go out there, you could tell where is right and left. I can't tell right from left. I have to shake my hand. I have to make like this to know that this is the hand I write with. Therefore, this is the right side. If you put me on a highway and you let me go, I can't find my way back. I go to lectures sometimes, and I ask people to take me to the bathroom and not to go away because I can't find my way back to the lecture room. I am brain damaged. You can't tell me I'm inferior intellectually to anyone else, because that part of my brain which was kept intact, I use it more than most other people use it. So you see, even if you have a potential advantage, that doesn't make you superior. You see, you can't. That is the reason why theories of racial inferiority and racial superiority doesn't make sense. The Europeans started a lot of nonsense about the size of the brain, and then when he'd gone pretty far, then they discovered that Immanuel Kant, who was the most brilliant European of his time, had a pint-sized brain. He had the smallest brain. So you see, I mean, he could have built a whole lot of theories about how he has this big brain and how it has all of these convolutions, and then he find a little guy, a little brain like this. He opened the most brilliant man, and he find a little pint-sized. When I die and they open they're going to find part of it is just blanked out. I don't carry as much brain as most other people, but I make full use of the piece that I have. Okay, I think in some ways I have answered that.
Thank you very much.
All right. I translate what you're saying is that since initially all men were African, um, one, there is a need, in a sense, almost to return to African values, okay, to something that has some sort of root in Africa, okay. I think that the reconstruction of African history helps in that sense because the Europeans came to that conclusion, by the way, after the war. Some Europeans in France and so forth, many European intellectuals started to talk like that. Sartre and various other people, they felt that if Europe was to recover itself, if it was to heal itself, if it was not to destroy itself, which it is doing now, that it had to Africanize itself. In other words, it had to go back, it had to move away from those values that led to destruction and give a new power and healing, a new redemption through that which is African. I think that that can come partly through an emphasis on the African contribution. That can bring people closer to moving away from things that they seem to think are the only values to a different kind of value. My book, They Came Before Columbus, deals with that much, much earlier than the Aztecs or the Incas. My book shows that among the Olmec, the first North American civilization, and when I say North American, I include Mexico, because Mexico was not what it is today. Mexico included parts of California, it included Texas, it included Colorado and all of those places. So all that is Mexico, America then. It's not just Central. Okay, they have found now 14 stone heads. At the time I was writing, they would only found 11. They now have 14. They have found 14 stone heads with African-type features that belong to a civilization known as Olmec, dated somewhere around 800 BC. It's actually 948 to 680 BC. They have found skeletal types in the populations of the Olmec at Tlatilco, at Cerro de las Misas, at Monte Alban. They have found a significant proportion of the ruling class, not the common people, the ruling class to be African. As much as 13.5% at Tlatilco, going right down 200 years later at Monte Alban, it comes down to 4.5 as Africans begin to intermarry with Native American women. Then they have found the terracottas, a vast range of terracottas, clay sculptures of Africans with African-type beard, coloration of skin evoked by the oxide dyes in the clay, African-type hair, etc. This is in the private museums. I spent a lot of time in Mexico in August, just before the earthquake. I spent a week with von Wutenow, and last year I took 40 Americans with me. Minister Brown was one of them. He came with us to film the lectures. We went and looked at the terracottas, the clay sculptures. These are before Christ, showing African types in America. So you have clay sculptures, that is terracottas, stone heads, as well as skeletal types and skulls that have been established as African. This is very, very early. There have been other visits by Africans that are much later, like there are visits by the Mandingo, which affect the Aztecs, some of them. And you have visits to South America, which seem to have affected the Chavin Kupisnik culture, which is the same level as Olmec, and also later through Chavin have affected the Inca. And we're finding new things in South America. We find, for example, not much work has been done on that as yet, but there are other people in South America who has been affected by the Africans. They're now digging up and finding African heads. There's a remarkable, one of the things I found in Mexico when I was there in August, a stunning head. It is so realistic. It looks like a living person whose head has just been chopped off. Pure African. This is right in Peru. You know, and I remember a few years ago, 10 African archaeologists came to this country, and I took them to see Barry Fell's studio. Barry Fell is who wrote this book, America BC. While I was dealing with African, he was dealing with Europeans in America, although he didn't realize that some of his Europeans are really black, like Egyptians, Celts, etc. But he had a remarkable museum, and one of the Africans, who is chairman of the anthropology department in Khartoum in the Sudan, he came down and he looked in the wall and he saw a plaque of beaten gold. And he looked at it and he read in English something written in an ancient Egyptian language. And he says, which part of Egypt did you get this? Only 3 people in the world can read this. I'm one of them. And Barry Fell says, that's not from Egypt, that is from Peru. He says, I don't believe you. This could not have been in Peru. And we had to spend half an hour to convince him. You know, he nearly got a heart attack. It's absolutely amazing. This is incredible. I mentioned last year in New Mexico, I mentioned to the Western Epigraphic Society, I mentioned that Minister Brown and I think we took a photograph of some markings on top of the head. You know, that started a whole new investigation. And when I went back to the Early Science Research Society in Massachusetts at Salem, I found that they have a new book out. They're starting to take photographs and draw the markings, and now they're trying to decipher them to see what these people were saying on the top of the head. So the evidence there is absolutely overwhelming. I'm now doing a sequel to They Came Before Columbus, which deals with that. I'm not saying that to be funny, but I have cut off. There are many historians who are experts on slavery, but I don't know anything about slavery. I have lost all interest in slavery. I'm only interested in what great things blacks did. Okay, there are millions of books on slavery, and slavery is not to be forgotten and it's not to be ignored. But I am the person who's come with a mission to give another picture to balance that one out. There are many historians who deal with slavery, but I don't have time. I have 25 years to live. And I don't have time to deal with slaves because they have 25 million historians dealing with that. I am dealing strictly with what Africans gave to the great civilizations in the world before they became slaves. Note that. I am interested in what Africa gave to the world before it was enslaved so that it can be free again. There's not Israel slavery in Egypt. The Jewish sect was discriminated against in ancient Egypt. The Jewish sect was not discriminated against because of its race, because it wasn't white. Okay, the Jews weren't white. So they weren't discriminated against because of their race. All peoples at all times have some measure of discrimination because you have always quarrels between groups, quarrels between denominations and sects. That goes on today too. I mean, that is natural. And the Jews, therefore, in Egypt came away with negative things about Egypt, and some of them, as they were reminded in the Bible, remember that how long you sojourned in that country and how much you learned from the Egyptians, okay? So that there's always been this love-hate relationship, because when the Jews wanted to escape, they went into Egypt, okay? So that the thing is that, you see, the Jewish thing is a very complicated business because the white Jew is a departure, okay? And you see, you're really dealing with these guys around here now, these recent Jews, okay? I mean, that doesn't enter real serious history, okay? You know, I mean, there are many people who came converted to the Jewish sect, who became Jews, etc. And as happens in many of these things, the other types, you know, declined in power and influence, etc. But I am not the master of the Jewish question, you see, because quite honestly, it takes so much energy to deal with the historical aspect. The only thing I know about the Jews in relation to blacks is that the blacks saved the Jews at the time when you had both black and Semitic Jews, but they were close enough. They were close enough for the blacks to go to protect the Jews. Taharqa, one of the greatest of African kings in his time, in 701 BC, sent an army, a Nubian and Egyptian army, into Jerusalem to save the Jews from the Asiatics. The Bible says there was a plague and the Assyrian forces were cut to pieces. But it wasn't a plague. It was the malaria, okay, which fell upon the Asiatics and really destroyed that army. So the blacks protected the Jews under Hezekiah against the Asiatics. And the reason why the blacks went to protect the Jews is because they were brothers. At that point in time, they were brothers. The Jewish thing has become very complicated because there's a whole range of things that has happened since then to do with European Jewry, etc. And I don't know much about that because it isn't at that stage, it ceases to be so much African history, it becomes more European history. But there is an aspect, there are many aspects of the Jewish thing that is part of African history. Well, there are experts in the Bible. One of the things you should read, which is very interesting, there's a man called Kofa, whom I met last year, who is an expert on this question, who could help you considerably. He's written an article in a book which I edited, Nile Valley Civilizations, in which he deals with the Jews and Egyptians. I can't remember it, but he deals with every reference to Egypt made in the whole Bible. Every possible reference, what is negative, what is positive, what is the relations of the Jews to the Egyptians, who are the Israelites, Judahites, Jews, etc. And I think he has written a lot on the subject, so he has references. So that is very helpful to follow up that question, because I know this is a burning question. I have recently been heavily questioned about the Jews, because a picture of me appears with Farrakhan in the final call. And I was called to ask, what do I have against the Jews? And I pointed out that I have nothing to do with that. I stood on Farrakhan's platform because Farrakhan invited me to speak on black achievements. And if the Ku Klux Klan was mad enough to invite me to speak on black achievements, they need the education, I would do it. So I am not involved in any anti-Semitic from all black leaders who seek to create a picture of black achievement, whatever the differences one may have with them about their views of various people, groups, or sects. I join in that respect, okay, because that is common ground. But where his opinions about Jews are concerned, I have nothing to do with that. I don't want to be sucked into that. And I was asked, please answer the question, are you anti-Jewish? I said, how could I be anti-Jewish? My publisher is Jewish. My dentist is Jewish. My lawyer is Jewish. My psychiatrist is Jewish. My best friends are Jews. Okay. All right. No, let me answer that. The reason why the tendency towards albinism occurred, and that has nothing to do with leprosy, though it is a deviation, is because the mineralization of the bones requires the synthesis of vitamin D. In the tropics, it is necessary to be black or to have some melanin shield, because ultraviolet radiation, this shield protects you, but there's such abundant sunlight that you could still synthesize vitamin D. In the extreme cold that occurred during a particular period in Europe, that became a problem because there wasn't abundant sunlight. There was weak and tangential sunlight. There was the cave dwelling. There were the hides of animals, etc. So that vitamin D synthesis with a melanin shield became a difficult problem. Hence, when there were tendencies to albinism, that albino was likely to stabilize itself because it became a selective advantage. Okay, that doesn't make that type inferior or superior. It only makes it more suited to a particular crisis in the ice. Okay, so that after a while, that deviant becomes stabilized and it doesn't become, therefore, a mutation in terms of inferiority or superiority, merely that type becomes more the type that is stabilized. But to say that leprosy produced whites, you would then have to deal with the problem about all whites are diseased, and that can't be established, because if you did medicine, you would find that is not true. No, whether theories have to be built not on assumptions, theories have to be built on facts. A theory can be right or wrong, but whether it is right or wrong, you have to show a body of scientific fact. If the theory is built on a mere assumption or a fantasy, then it's not really a theory, it is a fantasy. A theory must have a body of scientific fact. If the moment it is questioned, the scientific fact falls away, then it's not really a theory, it is a fantasy. Okay, you must have a body of scientific fact. Leprosy has certain specific things like AIDS. And unless you can establish in a laboratory that this is leprosy, you can't proceed any further because you have to have the medical knowledge to say, well, leprosy has A2, B2, or what have you, such and such factor, Kell factor, or what factor, and you can't find it in the laboratory. You have to abandon it because whatever any book may say, books are written by ordinary people, okay, whether they're inspired or uninspired. And a book stands or a theory stands by the body. For example, I can't jump up and say Africans were in America before Columbus. I never believed that. When I came to this country, I didn't believe that. I had to prove it to myself. In other words, it's not an opinion or a theory. My thesis about Africans in America before Columbus is not a theory. It is a proven fact. Because I can show the stone heads, I can show the terracottas, I can show the skeletons, I can show the structural correspondences between the pyramids, so that it ceases to be theory and becomes fact because it can be proven, not because Mr. X said so or Mr. Y says so or the Quran says so or the Bible says so, but because it can be proven to be so. And if something cannot be proven to be so, then you have to abandon the thesis. It's like Atlantis. Probably there is Atlantis. I don't know, but I can't prove it. Therefore, I don't talk about Atlantis. Okay. Yes. Yes. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. That this was not a lecture specifically on science, but it is important to note here that the Africans, according to the Greeks, like Herodotus, etc., they were the first to have specialists for every organ. In Egypt, you have this in the early period of medicine, you have specialists for every organ, and this is revived later in the Ptolemaic period. The tetracycline you mentioned is found among Nubians. They find the Nubians using tetracycline 14 centuries ago when we only started to use it in the 1950s. And we find also very complex things among the Africans. Africans using aspirin before us, using Salix capensis, which yields salicylic acid, the main active ingredient in aspirin. They were using other things before us, like we have got from the medicine press, urbane, capsicum, physostigmine, which deals with glaucoma, cola and calabar beans. They were the first to pioneer in the use of drugs to treat hypertension, like reserpine, which comes from them, carpectate comes from them, Annona senegalensis, which is used now for cancer, that comes from the African medicine chest. Also, they have one of the most effective skin remedies for certain skin diseases, etc. They also developed complex surgical operations. They were the best bandages in the world. The Africans are the only people in the world until recently who have their leaders mummified. You can still see Africans, you can still see the faces of Africans who died thousands of years ago. You can't see any European who died thousands of years ago. Okay, they brought chemistry of mummification to an extraordinary point where recently in 1964, I think it was in the University of Oklahoma, they found that the Africans had so well preserved Princess Mini, one of their princesses, that the cells in her hand were still intact. Okay, it is almost as they're taking it in a solution, like how we put organs in a solution in the hospital. That is the level they had reached. We also find certain medical operations like the cesarean section. That's not Egyptian. That was done by East Africans, the neurosurgeon. They noted East Africans performing the cesarean more than a century ago, at a time in the 1870s when the cesarean was experimental in Europe. And when every attempt at the cesarean in Europe led to the death of the mother, they could only save the child, whereas the Africans saved both child and mother. And the Africans were found to be using both anesthetics and antiseptics in the operating theaters. Why it's important to note this, they were also the first to invent the vaccine. Why it's important to note this is because when you look at TV today, all you see is sickness, disease, and famine in Africa. Nobody inquires what is the background to that, how did that happen? They say these are backward people, the Africans can't protect themselves. So people don't usually inquire into background, they just see the living present and that is thrown at them. That is one of the reasons why I've pointed out that most people's interest in Africa is only with them as primitives in the past and as problems in the present. They're not interested in anything else. They don't want to see anything but the dark side of the moon, the backside of the moon, the backside of Africa. That is the only thing that is put before us, the backside of Africa. Anything that has to do with the remarkable achievements of Africans, that is the reason why students don't want students do not want to identify with Africans. I teach a course called Black Civilizations. If I call it African Civilizations, it gets 3 students. When I change it to Black Civilization, the same thing I'm teaching. If I call it Black Civilization, it gets 50 students. Blacks and whites. You call it African Civs, no students come. They don't want to hear the word African because African to them means primitive. It means disease, disaster, famine, etc. They don't understand what happened. So they can't associate with that African because they think that that African is only linked to a certain kind of darkness. It's very important to note